The manila folder sitting on my kitchen counter felt entirely too thick, smelling faintly of the expensive vanilla perfume my daughter-in-law always wore. I wiped a thin layer of sawdust from my hands, a habit left over from 40 years as a custom carpenter, and slid my thumb under the flap. The heavy paper rustled, loud in the quiet morning air, revealing a medical intake form for a memory care evaluation. My name, Harold Mercer, was printed at the top. I was 68 years old, still building oak dining tables in my garage, but this document was designed to prove my mind was gone. The heavy thud of a golden retriever's tail against the cabinets broke the silence, and Roscoe pressed his graying muzzle against my knee. I folded the paper and shoved it deep into my flannel pocket, just as the kitchen door swung open. "He forgot to lock the side gate again, Daniel," Melissa said, her high heels clicking sharply against the hardwood I had laid myself. Her voice was pitched low, that breathy whisper she used when she wanted to sound deeply concerned, though her eyes were flat and cold. "It is becoming a safety issue." My son followed closely behind her, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the expensive shop downtown. He handed her a cup and looked at the floor, refusing to meet my gaze. "Dad, maybe we should talk about getting some help around here, because Melissa is just worried." "The gate is locked," I said, keeping my voice even. I reached down and scratched Roscoe behind his ears, feeling the familiar coarse fur that always grounded me. I checked it before I fed Roscoe. "See?" Melissa sighed, resting a manicured hand on my son's arm. "He really believes he checked it. It is getting worse, and this dog is just too much for him to handle." I looked at the woman who had moved into my home 1 year ago, under the guise of saving money for a down payment. She hated the dog hair, hated the smell of wood stain, and most of all, she hated that the deed to this house was still in my name. "Roscoe is not a burden," I told her, my jaw aching from the effort to remain polite. "Eleanor brought him home a week before she started chemotherapy, so he is the last thing my wife gave me." Melissa offered a tight, practiced smile. "We all miss Eleanor, but we have to live in the present, Harold. She never called me Dad. Daniel, we are going to be late for work." They left, and the front door closed with a solid thud. The house grew quiet again, save for the rhythmic clicking of Roscoe's claws on the floorboards as he followed me to the back porch. I pulled the memory clinic form from my pocket, smoothing out the creases. It was not just the form that bothered me. Last week, my silver watch had vanished from my nightstand. The week before that, a stack of mail containing my bank statements had mysteriously been misplaced. I am not a confrontational man, but I am not foolish either. I walked out to my woodworking shop, pulling a small camera from a supply box. The air in the garage smelled of pine and old oil, a comforting scent that usually settled my nerves. Today, it offered no relief. I spent the next 20 minutes discreetly mounting the device beneath the eaves of the front porch, angling the lens perfectly toward the driveway and the front gate. I tucked the wires behind the wooden trim, making sure nothing was visible unless you knew exactly where to look. I did not want an argument, but I wanted proof that I was not losing my mind. My memory was sharp, and I needed the footage to prove it when the time came. Around noon, the sky darkened with thick, gray clouds, bringing a sharp chill to the air. I went into the garage to sand a set of chair legs, leaving the side door open so Roscoe could wander between the yard and his bed inside the mudroom. The roar of the sander drowned out the ambient noise of the neighborhood. I lost myself in the work, the smooth grain of the wood beneath my fingers, offering a familiar comfort. I must have been working for 2 hours before I realized the garage was too quiet. Usually, Roscoe would nudge my elbow when he wanted a treat or a walk. I turned off the sander. "Roscoe?" I called out. Only the wind answered, rustling the dry leaves across the driveway. I wiped my hands on a rag and walked into the mudroom. His bed was empty, and his water bowl was full. I stepped out into the backyard, whistling our familiar 2-note call. The yard was still. My heart gave a heavy, irregular thump. I walked quickly to the side gate, the cool wind biting through my flannel shirt. The iron latch was thrown wide open. Panic, sharp and cold, flooded my chest. I ran down the sidewalk, calling his name, asking the postal worker, and knocking on a neighbor's door. The neighborhood was quiet, just the distant hum of a lawnmower and the wind rustling through the oaks. Nobody had seen a golden retriever. My chest heaved, pulling in ragged breaths as I circled the block 3 times. I checked the park at the end of the street, calling out until my throat felt raw and my voice cracked. The thought of Roscoe wandering alone, confused and looking for me, made my stomach twist into painful knots. When I finally returned to the house, Melissa's white vehicle was parked in the driveway. My son's wife was standing on the porch, holding her phone, her face arranged in an expression of tragic pity. "I came home for lunch and found the gate wide open," she said softly, though I noticed her hands were perfectly steady. "I drove around for 30 minutes, Harold, but he is gone. You forgot to lock the gate again." I stared at her, then down at the open gate. I knew I had secured that latch. I knew it in my bones. I looked up at the corner of the porch, where the tiny black lens of the camera was hidden in the shadows. I did not look directly at the device, but the knowledge of it sat heavy in my mind. "We will find him," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I am so sorry, Harold," she replied, stepping closer to pat my shoulder. The scent of vanilla perfume washed over me, thick and suffocating. "But maybe this is for the best, because you cannot even remember to close a door anymore." The woman turned and walked inside, leaving me standing in the cold driveway. I pulled my phone from my pocket, my hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock the screen. Before I could open the camera application to check the footage, my phone lit up with an incoming call from an unknown number. I answered it, holding the device to my ear. "Is this Harold Mercer?" a woman asked. Her voice was brisk, professional, underscored by the sounds of barking dogs and ringing telephones. "Yes," I breathed. "This is the Oak Valley Veterinary Clinic," she said. "A gentleman just brought in a golden retriever he found, and we scanned his microchip." "Yes," I breathed into the phone, pressing the device tight against my ear. "This is Harold." The woman on the other end paused, and I heard the faint, rapid clicking of a computer keyboard in the background. "Mr. Mercer, my name is Evelyn Carter. I am the head veterinarian here. Your golden retriever is safe." My knees gave out just a little, and I leaned against the porch railing. The rough, painted wood dug into my palm, grounding me. "I will be right there to get him. Thank you so much." "Well, that is the thing," Dr. Carter said softly, her tone shifting from professional to incredibly cautious. "When we scanned his microchip, the scanner returned his identification number just fine. But when I entered that number into the registered microchip database, it did not just bring up your contact information. It generated a severe red flag in our system." Melissa took a step toward me on the cold concrete driveway. Her perfectly plucked eyebrows drew together, and she mouthed the words, asking who was calling. I turned my back to her, shielding the phone from the wind. "What kind of flag?" I asked. "A legal hold," the veterinarian explained. "The registry lists Roscoe as protected property under a family trust. The emergency contact is not you. It is attorney Arthur Bennett. The system automatically notified his office the moment I entered the chip number, and he is actually on the other line with my receptionist right now." A sharp breeze swept across the yard, carrying the scent of impending rain and damp earth. Eleanor's lawyer. My wife had spent weeks sitting at the dining room table with Arthur Bennett during her final months, drafting thick documents she swore would keep me safe after she was gone. I had never understood why a dog needed a high-priced estate lawyer. Now, standing on my driveway with my daughter-in-law hovering inches away, the pieces began to shift in the dark. "Dr. Carter, please do not let anyone else take that dog," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "I am on my way." I ended the call and slipped the phone into my flannel pocket. Melissa was practically vibrating with nervous energy. The tragic pity she had worn moments ago was gone, replaced entirely by a sharp, calculating stare. "Who was that?" she demanded, crossing her arms tightly over her expensive cashmere sweater. "Did they find him?" "A clinic 2 towns over," I said, walking past her toward my old truck. "Someone dropped him off. I am going to pick him up." "I will drive you," she offered immediately, already reaching into her purse for her keys. "You are too upset, Harold. You should not be behind the wheel right now. Daniel would never forgive me if you got into an accident because you were confused." I wanted to tell her to stay away from me, but refusing would only give her more ammunition for her memory care campaign. She would call my son at his office and tell him I was acting erratic and aggressive. So I nodded, pulled open the passenger door of her pristine white SUV, and climbed inside. The interior smelled like new leather and that suffocating vanilla perfume. We drove in heavy silence, the heater blowing warm air against my frozen hands. Her knuckles were stark white where she gripped the steering wheel, and she checked her rearview mirror every 10 seconds. She was driving too fast, tapping her manicured nails against the console at every red light. The Oak Valley Veterinary Clinic sat in a small commercial plaza next to a dry cleaner. We walked through the glass doors into a waiting room that smelled strongly of bleach, wet fur, and medicinal dog shampoo. A tall woman with graying hair pulled into a tight bun met us at the front desk. Her eyes darted from me to Melissa. "Mr. Mercer," Dr. Carter said, extending a hand. Then she looked directly at my daughter-in-law. "And you are?" "Melissa Mercer," she answered quickly, stepping slightly in front of me to command the space. "I am his primary caregiver. We are so relieved someone found our dog. Harold left the gate open this morning and his memory has been slipping lately, so it has been a very stressful day for our family." The veterinarian did not smile. She looked right past Melissa and focused entirely on me. "Mr. Mercer, if you will follow me to exam room 3. We have someone waiting on speakerphone." Melissa tried to follow us down the narrow hallway, her heels clicking sharply on the tile, but Dr. Carter paused at the door. "Family members only by legal definition, please." The attorney was very specific. "I am family," Melissa snapped, her voice rising a full octave. "You are an in-law," Dr. Carter replied with brutal calm. "You can wait in the lobby." I stepped into the small exam room and closed the door, leaving Melissa glaring through the narrow glass window. The moment the heavy latch clicked shut, a wet nose nudged my hand. Roscoe whined, his tail thumping rhythmically against the metal examination table. I knelt on the cold linoleum floor and buried my face in his thick fur. He smelled like dust and unfamiliar car exhaust, but he was entirely unharmed. My chest finally stopped aching. "Harold?" A voice crackled from a black office phone sitting on the metal counter. "Is that you?" "I am here, Arthur," I said, standing up and keeping one hand firmly resting on Roscoe's warm head. "I am glad the dog is safe," Attorney Bennett said. The lawyer sounded exactly as he had 2 years ago, sharp, efficient, and devoid of any unnecessary small talk. "Listen to me carefully, Harold. The National Registry triggered a notification because Eleanor placed a specific protection order on this animal. I need to know exactly how he left your property today." I glanced at the door. Melissa's shadow paced back and forth in the hallway, passing the frosted glass window every few seconds. "The side gate was opened," I answered carefully. "My daughter-in-law claims I forgot to lock it, but I know what I did." A heavy pause filled the line, followed by the sound of a pen tapping against a desk. "I see. Harold, I am going to ask Dr. Carter to board Roscoe here at the clinic for the next 24 hours. Panic flared hot in my chest. "No. I am taking my dog home." "You cannot do that," Bennett insisted gently. "Not until we secure the chain of custody. If someone intentionally removed that dog from your care, returning him to the same house before we verify the facts puts him at risk all over again. Eleanor's trust contains very specific clauses regarding his safety. I am the trustee responsible for enforcing Eleanor's trust. If you consent, Dr. Carter can keep Roscoe here temporarily while we document the chain of custody. I strongly recommend we do that before anyone attempts to take him home." I looked down at Roscoe. His brown eyes were trusting, but his posture was exhausted. Taking him back to a house where Melissa had keys and long blocks of unsupervised time suddenly felt incredibly reckless. She had taken him once. She would absolutely try again, and next time, she might not drop him off where a scanner could find him. "Keep him safe, Dr. Carter," I said, my voice thick with unshed emotion. "Just for tonight. He will get premium care, Mr. Mercer," the veterinarian promised softly, clipping a heavy nylon lead to his collar. "Harold," Bennett called out through the speaker, demanding my attention again. "I need you at my office tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock sharp. We have to review the trust binder. Eleanor anticipated something like this might happen, and there are provisions you need to see. Things she did not want to show you until it was absolutely necessary." "What kind of provisions?" I asked, feeling a strange chill settle over my shoulders despite the warm room. "Just be here," the lawyer replied. "And Harold, do not bring anyone else, especially not anyone living in your house." I ended the call and spent another 5 minutes petting my dog, memorizing the steady rhythm of his breathing. When I finally walked back out to the waiting room alone, Melissa was pacing near the entrance. She looked past me, expecting to see a golden retriever on a leash. "Where is he?" she asked, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. "The clinic has to hold him overnight for observation," I lied smoothly, deeply surprised by how easily the words came to me. "State protocol for found animals with missing tags." Melissa exhaled, a long breath that sounded suspiciously like sheer relief. "Well, that is just more money down the drain. Let's go home, Harold. You look completely exhausted, and Daniel is going to want to talk about how we manage things from now on." I followed her out to the SUV, the image of that hidden porch camera burning bright and steady in my mind. My daughter-in-law thought she was building a flawless case against my sanity. She had no idea she had just walked straight into a trap my wife had set 2 years before she died. Melissa drove us back to the house in absolute silence, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned pale against the dark leather. The tires hummed a monotonous rhythm against the asphalt, doing nothing to drown out the heavy tension filling the cabin. Every time she checked her rearview mirror, a flicker of nervous energy crossed her face. She thought she was transporting a confused, broken old man. I kept my eyes fixed on the passing trees, letting her believe exactly what she wanted. When we walked through the front door, my son was waiting in the kitchen. Daniel still wore his gray work suit, his tie loosened around his neck, looking completely exhausted. Before I could even take off my coat, Melissa rushed across the room and buried her face against his chest. She performed a perfect, breathless imitation of a woman desperately holding back tears. "He is gone, Dan," she whispered, her voice carrying easily across the silent kitchen. Harold left the side gate open again, and Roscoe just wandered off into the street. The veterinary clinic says they have to keep the dog overnight because of some state protocol. It was a disaster. Daniel looked at me over his wife's shoulder. The dark circles under his eyes made him look 10 years older than 35. He gently rubbed Melissa's back, treating her like the victim of this ordeal. "Dad, we need to sit down and talk," Daniel said, his tone thick with patronizing patience. I did not sit down. I looked at the man I had raised, feeling the weight of the memory clinic form still folded in my flannel pocket. "I need to change my boots first," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly flat and hollow. I walked past them, my heavy boots thudding against the hardwood floor. Instead of heading to my bedroom, I turned the corner and stepped into the small study at the back of the house. Eleanor and I had used this room for 30 years to manage the household bills and store our important documents. It always smelled faintly of dried lavender and old paper. Now, Melissa used it as her personal office. Her silver laptop was sitting open on my wife's antique mahogany desk, the screen dark, but the power light blinking softly. I closed the study door without making a sound. My hands moved quickly, driven by a cold, clear focus that completely erased my earlier panic about Roscoe. I touched the smooth glass of the trackpad, waking the computer fully. She had not bothered to lock the screen or close her email client. A message sat right at the top of the inbox, sent directly from the Oak Valley Memory Center. I leaned closer, reading the text on the bright screen. The clinic administrator was thanking Melissa for confirming the evaluation appointment for Harold Mercer. The second paragraph made my stomach twist into a painful knot. It explicitly stated that my son Daniel had signed the preliminary intake forms, which the clinic had received that very morning. Daniel had signed them. My own son had authorized a cognitive evaluation behind my back. I clicked on the attached document, waiting a painful few seconds for the file to load. There was Daniel's signature, messy and hurried, right beneath a paragraph granting the doctor's permission to share my medical results with his wife. Looking at the date next to his signature, I noticed a detail that changed everything. The document was dated 3 days ago. Melissa had initiated this medical process long before Roscoe disappeared from the backyard. The missing dog was not the tragic accident that sparked her concern for my safety. It was the final piece of evidence she needed to prove her fabricated case. Daniel had a terrible habit of signing whatever paperwork his wife put in front of him without reading the fine print, a flaw she was clearly weaponizing against us both. I minimized the email window and opened her internet browser. The search history dropped down in a neat, damning list. She had spent the last 2 weeks researching how to obtain a medical power of attorney in our state. She had downloaded multiple legal templates. The most recent search query, time-stamped from just last night, read, "Transferring property deed after dementia diagnosis." She was planning to take absolutely everything: the house I built, the accounts I funded, and the authority to make my basic life decisions. I turned away from the glowing screen and looked down at the heavy oak filing cabinet in the corner of the room. It was the cabinet where I kept Eleanor's oldest files, the ones I rarely touched, because seeing her handwriting still caused a dull ache in my chest. The brass lock on the bottom drawer was scratched, the metal slightly bent, as if someone had wedged a screwdriver into the narrow gap. I knelt on the rug and pulled the heavy drawer open. A thick blue folder containing my wife's initial estate planning notes sat right on top of the pile, completely out of alphabetical order. I picked it up, flipping through the stiff pages. A bright yellow sticky note, written in Melissa's sharp cursive, was pressed against page 4. Her handwritten note summarized a single legal paragraph. It stated that if Harold Mercer was ever declared legally incompetent, the successor trustee would immediately assume full control of the $700,000 family fund. I stared at that yellow square of paper, feeling the pieces of the puzzle snap together with terrifying clarity. She had snooped through my private cabinet and found Eleanor's preliminary notes. My daughter-in-law believed that proving I was senile would instantly hand her the keys to a massive fortune. She thought she understood the rules of the game. What Melissa did not know, and what she could never have found in that cabinet, was that Eleanor had changed the trust 2 weeks before she passed away. Those preliminary notes in the blue folder were incomplete. My wife had gone to Attorney Bennett's office alone to draft the final version of our estate, and the only copy of the official amendment was locked securely in a steel vault downtown. Melissa had read just enough to fuel her boundless greed, completely missing the caretaker clause that legally protected Roscoe. Heavy footsteps sounded in the hallway, approaching the study. "Dad?" Daniel called out, his voice muffled by the solid wood door. "Are you in there?" "Melissa says, we need to finalize your schedule for next week." Next week, the week of the memory evaluation. Pulling my phone from my pocket, I quickly snapped clear photographs of the signed intake form, the clinic email, and her damning search history. With the digital evidence safely secured in my camera roll, I closed the blue folder, shoved it back into the drawer, and shut the laptop screen. When I opened the study door, my son was standing there with a printed calendar in his hand, looking terribly uncomfortable. "We have a doctor's appointment on Tuesday," Daniel said, avoiding my eyes entirely. "Just a routine checkup. Melissa took the morning off to drive us." "I see," I replied gently, keeping my hands relaxed at my sides. I looked past him into the living room. Melissa stood by the stone fireplace, holding a warm cup of tea, watching me with a look of absolute triumph. She thought she had already won the war. But as I reached into my pocket and touched the hidden medical form, I glanced back at the mahogany desk and realized something else was missing. The original deed to the house was no longer in the drawer. I left the house before 7 the next morning, pulling my truck out of the driveway while my son and his wife were still asleep. The air felt heavy with impending rain, and the drive downtown took 30 minutes in the sluggish commuter traffic. Attorney Arthur Bennett was already waiting for me in his office on the 3rd floor of a brick building that smelled strongly of lemon polish and old leather. He sat behind a massive wooden desk, his silver pen tapping a rhythmic beat against a thick legal pad. I sat down in the leather guest chair, telling him about the missing deed and the memory clinic paperwork I had found the previous afternoon. Bennett did not look surprised, and he simply shook his head, pushing a heavy pair of reading glasses up his nose. "The physical deed means absolutely nothing, Harold," the lawyer explained in a calm, measured voice. "Eleanor transferred the property into the trust over a year ago. Melissa can wave that piece of paper around all she wants, but she cannot sell a single brick of your house without my authorization. Your wife anticipated this exact kind of greed. She thinks she can get your authorization by proving I am incompetent," I said, feeling my jaw tighten. "Which is exactly why we need to focus on the dog," Bennett replied, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the polished wood. "Roscoe is safe at the clinic, but we need concrete proof of how he ended up there." Eleanor included highly specific stipulations in her final amendment, and if we want to protect your assets completely, we have to prove your daughter-in-law intentionally removed that animal from your care. A simple assumption will not hold up if this goes to a judge. The attorney tapped his pen one last time, looking me directly in the eye. "Find the buyer, Harold. Find the financial transaction. We need a paper trail that cuts through her lies." I left the law office feeling a cold sense of purpose settling into my chest. Instead of driving straight home, I parked my truck 2 streets over and walked the rest of the way to my neighbor's house. Marcus lived directly across the street from me, a retired mechanic who spent his days watching the neighborhood from his front porch. More importantly, he had a high-definition security camera mounted above his garage door, pointed squarely at my front gate. Marcus welcomed me inside his living room, which smelled faintly of stale coffee and peppermint standing out against the damp morning air. I asked for a favor, and within 5 minutes, we were sitting on his faded floral sofa, staring at a silver tablet screen. He pulled up the archived footage from yesterday morning, his calloused thumb scrolling back through the timeline until the clock on the screen hit 9:15. The video was silent, making the betrayal unfolding on the screen feel even more surreal. My daughter-in-law walked out of the side gate, holding Roscoe by his red nylon leash. She did not look panicked or concerned. She stood on the edge of the sidewalk, checking her phone, until a faded blue sedan pulled up to the curb. A young woman in a denim jacket stepped out of the driver's side door. Melissa spoke to the stranger for barely a minute. Then, she held up her phone, and the young woman scanned the screen with her own device. A digital payment. Melissa handed over the leash, turned around, and walked back into my house without looking back once. "Well, I will be damned," Marcus whispered, pausing the video just as the blue sedan pulled away. "Do you know who that girl is?" I squinted at the screen, studying the faded parking permit stuck to the bottom corner of the sedan windshield. It was a bright orange sticker from the community college down the highway. I did not know her name, but I recognized the faded green apron hanging over the passenger seat. She was the weekend barista at the diner where Eleanor and I used to eat Sunday breakfast. After thanking Marcus and swearing him to strict secrecy, the drive to the diner on Elm Street passed in a tense blur. The lunch rush had not started yet, leaving the restaurant mostly empty and smelling strongly of fried bacon and harsh bleach. The young woman from the video was wiping down the front counter. When she looked up and saw me walking through the glass doors, the color drained completely out of her face. Taking a seat on a vinyl stool directly across from her, my hands trembled slightly. To hide the anger, I pressed them flat against the cool laminate counter. "You bought my golden retriever yesterday morning," I said, keeping my voice as gentle as I could manage. The young woman stepped back, her eyes wide with genuine panic. "I thought I was rescuing him. The lady who sold him to me posted on a community bulletin board that her father-in-law was being moved to a locked dementia ward today. She said the dog was going to the pound to be put down because nobody in the family wanted an old, sick animal. I paid a $100 rehoming fee just to get him out of there." A heavy, suffocating weight pressed down on my chest. Melissa had not just sold my dog, but she had used my fabricated illness to play on a stranger's pity. She was building the narrative of my decline in the neighborhood, laying the groundwork so nobody would question my sudden departure to a nursing facility. "I am not going to a facility," I told the terrified barista, watching her shoulders slump in relief. "And the dog is currently safe at a veterinary clinic. But I need your help to prove what that woman did to me." The girl swallowed hard and pulled her smartphone from her apron pocket. Her hands moved quickly across the screen before she slid the device across the counter toward me. "Her name on the application is Melissa Mercer," the barista explained quietly. "There is the transaction receipt for $100 and the text messages where she gave me your address and told me to park on the street so you would not hear my car." I looked down at the bright screen, reading the digital evidence of my daughter-in-law's cruelty. The text messages were incredibly callous, complaining about dog hair ruining the hardwood floors and rushing the buyer to arrive before I finished working in my garage. It was an undeniable, perfectly preserved chain of evidence. "Can you send screenshots of all this to my email address?" I asked, pulling a small notebook from my shirt pocket to write down my information. Of course, she agreed immediately, typing the address into her phone. "Are you going to call the police?" I thought about the memory clinic appointment my son had scheduled for Tuesday, and the blue trust folder Melissa had violated in my study. Calling the police would result in a simple theft charge, a minor inconvenience that would never stop her from targeting the rest of my life. I needed to let her walk willingly into the trap Eleanor had built. "No," I replied, standing up from the stool and buttoning my coat against the cold. "I am going to let her think she got away with it." I walked through the front door of my house, the digital screenshots from the young barista burning a hole in my phone. The hallway smelled intensely of roasted garlic and rosemary, a warm, comforting scent that felt completely out of place against the cold reality of what I had just learned. Melissa stood at the kitchen island, pulling a heavy glass baking dish from the oven. She wore a floral apron over her expensive cashmere sweater, playing the role of the devoted homemaker to absolute perfection. "Harold," she said, her voice dripping with artificial warmth, "I made your favorite chicken recipe. Daniel will be home in a few minutes, and we can all have a nice, quiet family dinner to decompress." I did not answer her. Instead, I walked straight into my bedroom, locked the heavy wooden door, and opened my email application. I attached the photographs of Melissa's laptop screen and the memory clinic forms, along with every single screenshot of the Venmo receipts from the barista. Forwarding the entire package to Arthur Bennett, I typed a short note asking him to formally preserve the evidence. Within 2 minutes, my phone vibrated in my palm. The lawyer confirmed the files were secure, legally admissible, and safely stored in his firm's database. The trap was fully armed, and all I had to do was wait for them to step inside. I heard the front door open, followed by the low murmur of my son's voice. When I finally emerged from my bedroom and took my usual seat at the dining table, Daniel looked completely drained. He wore his gray suit pants and a wrinkled dress shirt, pushing his roasted chicken around his ceramic plate while refusing to meet my eyes. The silence in the room was thick and suffocating, heavy with unspoken accusations. "We were just talking about Tuesday, Dad," Daniel mumbled, finally looking up from his meal. "The clinic called to confirm your checkup. Melissa says you had a really hard time this morning, and we just want to make sure your mind is staying healthy." "That is a very interesting appointment," I said, setting my fork down. The sharp clink echoed loudly in the quiet room, especially since you scheduled it 3 days before Roscoe supposedly wandered out of the open gate. My son frowned, a deep crease forming between his brows. He looked across the table at his wife. "What are you talking about?" "Melissa set that up yesterday afternoon, right after we realized you were having trouble remembering things." I looked directly at my daughter-in-law. Her jaw tightened, just a fraction of an inch, but her eyes remained wide and perfectly innocent. "The intake form has your signature on it, Daniel," I explained, keeping my tone perfectly flat. "It is dated Wednesday. You signed a medical release for a memory evaluation before the dog ever went missing." "Daniel signs dozens of papers a week for our taxes and the house," Melissa interrupted smoothly, reaching over to pat his hand with practiced affection. "You must have looked at the wrong date, Harold. It is perfectly normal to get confused with paperwork at your age, and that is exactly why we are getting you help." But Daniel pulled his hand away from hers, just slightly. He was a passive man who hated conflict, but he was not entirely stupid. He remembered signing those papers on the kitchen counter. He remembered his wife telling him it was just a standard insurance update for our homeowner policy. The first real crack appeared in her perfect facade, and I watched the realization slowly dawn in his exhausted eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could form a question, his cell phone vibrated violently against the wood table. Daniel glanced at the caller identification screen, looking genuinely confused. "It is the Oak Valley Veterinary Clinic," he said, answering the call and placing it on speakerphone so we could all hear. Dr. Carter's crisp, professional voice filled the dining room. "Daniel Mercer, I am calling to update you on the legal hold placed on your father's dog. Attorney Bennett has officially verified the trust registry, and Roscoe will remain in our medical boarding facility until the legal dispute is resolved." "Legal dispute?" Daniel echoed, staring down at the glowing phone screen. "What trust registry?" "Melissa told me state protocol required a 24-hour stray hold because the dog did not have his collar." A long pause stretched over the phone line. "I am sorry, Mr. Mercer, but that is completely incorrect," the veterinarian replied, with brutal clarity. "The dog is protected property under a registered legal trust. Attorney Bennett will explain the rest of the details to your family." The call disconnected, leaving a heavy, ringing silence hanging over the dinner plates. Daniel turned his head slowly, staring at the woman sitting next to him. The narrative she had built so carefully was fracturing right in front of him, broken apart by an outside authority she could not control or manipulate. Melissa recovered instantly, standing up from her chair with her face flushed bright red with righteous indignation. "This is exactly what I have been trying to tell you, Dan. Harold is hoarding assets in some secret trust while living under our roof and making us pay for his groceries. His mind is slipping, and his lawyer is just enabling his paranoia to keep billing him." Right on cue, my own phone began to ring. I pulled it from my pocket and checked the screen. It was Arthur Bennett. I answered the call, pressing the speaker button and setting the device right next to my son's empty water glass. "Harold," the attorney said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "Given the current situation with the trust property, I am scheduling an emergency legal mediation at my office tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. I expect you, your son, and his wife to be present. Tell them to bring all the medical documents they have been gathering." Melissa smiled, a sharp, predatory expression that chilled the room. She looked down at Daniel, her confidence entirely restored by the mention of the medical documents. She smoothed the front of her floral apron and lifted her chin proudly. "We will be there," Melissa answered for me, speaking directly into the phone. She fully believed she was walking into a coronation, assuming the lawyer was finally going to hand her the keys to my entire estate. She had absolutely no idea she was walking straight into an execution. The heavy mahogany door to Arthur Bennett's office clicked shut behind us, sealing out the muted ringing of telephones from the reception area. The room smelled strongly of lemon polish and dark roasted coffee, a sharp contrast to the damp morning air outside. I took the guest chair on the far left, resting my weathered hands flat on my denim knees. Daniel sat down heavily beside me, immediately picking at a loose thread on his gray suit pants. His wife took the center seat, sitting perfectly upright. Melissa had dressed for a corporate takeover. She wore a tailored navy blazer, her hair pulled back into a severe knot, and clutched a thick plastic folder to her chest. She had arranged her features into a flawless mask of solemn duty, fully prepared to accept the keys to my entire estate. Bennett sat behind his massive wooden desk, steepled his fingers, and looked at the three of us with clinical detachment. Good morning. We are here to discuss the legal status of Eleanor Mercer's family trust, specifically regarding the protective hold currently placed on the golden retriever, Roscoe. Arthur, thank you so much for arranging this quickly, Melissa began, immediately taking charge of the room. She flipped open her plastic folder and pulled out a neat stack of printed documents. I brought the medical intake forms from the Oak Valley Memory Center. Harold is declining rapidly, and we are prepared to initiate the formal guardianship petition next week. Since your preliminary notes list me as the successor trustee, we need to transition control of his bank accounts today so I can pay the facility deposit. She slid her papers across the smooth wood, her manicured fingers pressing firmly against the top page. My daughter-in-law was so incredibly confident, so thoroughly convinced of her own superior intelligence, that she actually smiled at the attorney. The lawyer did not even glance at her carefully curated documents. He simply reached into his bottom desk drawer and extracted a massive black leather binder, dropping it directly on top of her medical forms. The heavy thud made Daniel flinch in his seat. "That will not be happening, Mrs. Mercer," Bennett said, his voice cold and precise. "Because you are operating under a severe misunderstanding of this estate." Melissa stiffened, her smile vanishing instantly. "I saw the notes, Arthur. If he becomes legally incompetent, I take over the finances. That is the law." "You saw a preliminary draft," the attorney corrected smoothly, opening the heavy metal rings of the binder. "A draft Eleanor completely discarded 2 weeks before she passed away. She sat exactly where you are sitting right now and added a highly specific amendment to ring-fence the assets. She also left a handwritten letter to explain her reasoning, which I am legally obligated to read into the record today." A sudden sharp ache bloomed in my chest. Bennett turned to the very first page, revealing a piece of pale, yellow stationery. The sight of my wife's elegant sloping handwriting blurred my vision for a fraction of a second. I stared down at the dark blue ink, grounding myself in the quiet hum of the air conditioning unit, while the lawyer cleared his throat. "Your late wife left written instructions directing me to read this letter only if anyone attempted to challenge Harold's independence. Today, those conditions have been met. To my husband Harold," Bennett read aloud, his formal tone failing to mask the fierce protectiveness in Eleanor's words. "If this letter is being read, it means someone is attempting to challenge your independence. I know you, my love. You are a quiet man who will avoid a conflict just to keep the peace in this family. But I will not let anyone take advantage of your gentle nature." Daniel stopped picking at his trousers. His head snapped up, and a deep, mottled flush began to creep up his neck. Bennett continued reading without pausing for our reactions. "To my son, Daniel, I raised you to protect your family, but I fear you have grown entirely too passive. And to Melissa, I always knew you were looking at our bank accounts instead of our faces. You thought I was just a sick, oblivious old woman, but I saw exactly who you were. That is why I set up a final test." The silence in the room became absolute, heavy, and suffocating. Melissa's mouth hung open slightly, her confident posture crumbling into rigid shock. Her eyes darted from the yellow paper to the lawyer, searching for a punchline that was never going to come. "A test?" Daniel whispered, his voice cracking on the single syllable. "The trust currently holds $700,000, Bennett stated, flipping past the letter to the densely typed legal amendment section. "But control of that money is permanently tied to the welfare of the dog." Eleanor established the Caretaker Clause. It mandates that Harold retains full control of the estate as long as Roscoe is in his custody. The attorney looked directly at my son's wife, his expression entirely devoid of pity. The clause also explicitly states that if any family member intentionally removes, sells, or harms that animal, they are immediately and permanently disqualified from ever acting as a trustee. They forfeit all rights to the estate, forever. My hands remained perfectly still on my knees. I watched the realization hit Melissa like a physical blow to the stomach. All the color drained from her face, leaving her pale and trembling in the expensive leather chair. She had secretly sold the dog to break my spirit and fabricate a medical crisis, completely unaware that she was signing her own financial death warrant. Her own boundless greed had triggered the exact mechanism designed to destroy her. But a desperate, cornered animal will always lash out. Instead of confessing or showing a shred of remorse, Melissa gripped the armrests of her chair, straightened her spine, and pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. "This is ridiculous," she shouted, her voice shrill and echoing harshly off the wood-paneled walls. "That clause means absolutely nothing because he left the gate open. I did not remove the dog, Arthur. Harold lost him. He is senile, he is incompetent, and he endangered the animal himself. I am still the rightful successor, and you cannot prove otherwise." Daniel looked at his wife in horror, then turned his exhausted eyes toward me, silently begging for someone to make the screaming stop. I did not say a single word. I just sat quietly in my chair, listening to her dig her grave a little deeper, knowing the trap was about to snap completely shut. The echo of my daughter-in-law's shouting faded into the thick mahogany walls, leaving a heavy, ringing silence in its wake. Melissa stood trembling beside the heavy leather chair, her chest heaving as she pointed an accusing finger at me. She was desperately clinging to her fabricated reality, demanding that everyone in the room accept her version of the truth. Attorney Bennett did not raise his voice. He simply opened a thin manila folder resting on the corner of his desk and extracted a stack of glossy printed photographs. He slid the first image across the polished wood, stopping it directly in front of my son. "Nobody lost the dog, Melissa," the lawyer stated, his tone as cold and sharp as winter ice. "And we do not need to rely on Harold's memory to prove it." Daniel looked down at the photograph. I knew exactly what the image showed, because I had emailed the digital files to Bennett the previous evening. It was a clear, time-stamped screenshot from my neighbor's security camera. The picture perfectly captured Melissa standing on the edge of the sidewalk, handing Roscoe's red nylon leash to the young barista from the local diner. A small, strangled noise escaped Daniel's throat. He reached out with a trembling hand and pulled the next piece of paper from the stack. "That is a verified digital payment receipt," Bennett explained, leaning back in his chair and folding his hands. "The transaction is for $100, paid directly to an account registered in your wife's name." The attached text messages show her explicitly coordinating the sale, instructing the buyer to park down the street so Harold would not hear the vehicle approach. She sold the trust property for cash, completely unprovoked. The color drained out of Melissa's face so fast she looked physically ill. She stared at the receipts, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the edge of the desk. The absolute certainty that had carried her into the office was shattering into 1,000 irreparable pieces. "I can explain," she stammered, her voice dropping the aggressive edge and taking on a frantic, pleading tone. Melissa looked frantically at her husband. "Dan, please listen to me. I found the dog wandering near the street that morning. Harold really did leave the gate open. I swear it. I panicked because the dog is a hazard, and I thought rehoming him was the safest thing for everyone. I was just trying to protect our family. My daughter-in-law was lying, weaving a new deception right on top of the old one, but I could see the hesitation flicker in my son's eyes. Daniel wanted to believe her. He wanted any excuse to avoid the horrifying reality of who he had married. If she could convince him that the gate was genuinely left open, she might still manipulate her way out of the legal consequences. I could not let that happen. I reached into my denim pocket and pulled out my smartphone. The glass screen felt cold against my calloused palm. "You did not find him wandering, Melissa," I said quietly, drawing all the attention in the room. "And I did not leave the gate open." My son turned toward me, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Dad, what are you talking about?" "A few weeks ago, my silver watch disappeared from my nightstand," I explained, looking directly at the woman who had terrorized me in my own home. "Then, my bank statements vanished from the mail." I did not want to cause a pointless argument without proof, so I mounted a small motion-activated camera under the eaves of the front porch. Melissa stopped breathing. Her eyes widened, locking onto the small device in my hand, as if it were a loaded weapon. I unlocked the screen and opened the security application, tapping the archived file from Thursday morning. I turned the volume all the way up, sliding the phone across the smooth wooden desk so it rested right beside the Venmo receipts. The video started playing immediately. The footage was crystal clear, capturing the front yard in bright morning sunlight. On the screen, Melissa walked out the front door, pulling a very reluctant Roscoe by his collar. She did not look panicked, and there was no frantic search for a lost animal. We all watched in absolute silence as my daughter-in-law stopped by the large green trash bin at the edge of the driveway. She knelt down, unbuckled Roscoe's heavy leather collar, and tossed it casually into the garbage. Then, she walked him to the iron side gate. She unlatched the heavy metal lock herself, swinging the wooden door wide open, before dragging the dog out to the sidewalk to wait for the buyer's blue sedan. The video ended, leaving a frozen image of the open gate on the glowing screen. Nobody moved. The only sound in the office was the soft hum of the air conditioning vent overhead. Bennett broke the silence, his voice carrying the weight of a judge delivering a final verdict. "We also have the digital footprints from your laptop, Mrs. Mercer. The clinic intake forms you submitted for Harold were dated 3 days before this incident. You searched for power of attorney documents and deed transfer regulations the night before you sold the dog. This was not a panicked mistake. It was a calculated, premeditated strategy to declare my client incompetent and seize control of his estate." Melissa opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The mountain of documentary exhibits resting on the desk completely suffocated her usual barrage of excuses. The ring footage, the transaction receipts, the text messages, the hidden camera video, and the time-stamped medical emails formed an unbreakable chain of evidence. Every single contradiction was exposed, leaving her stripped of her caring caregiver persona and revealing the cold, calculating thief underneath. She looked at Daniel, reaching a trembling hand toward his sleeve. My son stood up so fast, his heavy leather chair skidded backward, hitting the wooden wainscoting with a loud crack. He stepped away from her, staring at the woman he had loved for 5 years as if she were a complete stranger. His face was pale, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles trembled under his skin. "Dan," she whispered, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes. Real tears this time, born of pure desperation. "Please." Daniel looked down at the frozen image of his wife throwing a beloved family pet's collar into the garbage. He took a slow, ragged breath, letting the undeniable reality wash away years of manipulation. "Did you really sell my father's dog?" Daniel's voice was completely hollow, barely louder than the hum of the air conditioning vent in the ceiling. The question hung in the heavy, lemon-scented air of the law office, demanding an answer that could not be spun or manipulated. Tears finally spilled over her perfectly powdered cheeks, leaving dark tracks of mascara behind. "I did it for us, Dan," she sobbed, reaching out to grasp his wrist. "Harold is impossible to live with, and that dog was ruining the hardwood floors. We needed the money to start our real life away from him. I was trying to secure our future." My son looked down at the hand, clutching his sleeve, his expression twisting into something resembling physical nausea. He pulled his arm away sharply, leaving her hand grasping at empty air. Daniel stepped back, putting 2 full feet of distance between himself and the woman he had married. "You sold my father's dog to a stranger," Daniel said, his voice trembling with a mix of blinding rage and profound grief. "You lied to me every single day for weeks, making me think the man who raised me was losing his mind, just so you could steal his money." "It was not stealing," she pleaded, her voice rising to a frantic pitch as she searched his face for any sign of forgiveness. "It is our inheritance." "It is not your inheritance," Bennett interrupted, his tone cutting through her hysteria like a serrated blade. The attorney opened a fresh folder on his desk, pulling out a legal document printed on thick, watermarked paper. "And as of this exact moment, you have completely forfeited any future claim to this estate." Bennett slid the heavy paper across the polished wood, stopping it right at the edge of the desk. "This is a formal notice of removal. By intentionally separating Harold from Roscoe, you have triggered the forfeiture provision of the Caretaker Clause. You are officially stripped of your status as successor trustee, effective immediately. You will never touch a single cent of the $700,000 trust." Melissa stared at the document, her mouth opening and closing silently. The absolute certainty of her wealth had vanished, replaced by a terrifying void. She looked at Daniel again, begging him to intervene, but my son just stared at the framed certificates on the wall, his jaw locked so tight the muscles trembled under his skin. But the financial ruin was only the beginning of the nightmare she had constructed for herself. Bennett picked up his silver pen, tapping it once against the desk, signaling a sharp shift in the conversation. "There is one more matter we need to discuss, Melissa," the lawyer continued, leaning forward with predatory focus, "and it involves the state prosecutor's office." My daughter-in-law flinched, pulling her hands into her lap as if trying to make herself smaller. "Fabricating a medical crisis to seize control of an elderly person's assets is not just unethical," Bennett explained softly, emphasizing every single word. "It is the literal definition of financial elder abuse. You orchestrated a fraudulent capacity evaluation, you stole private property, and you accepted a $100 payment under completely false pretenses. If my client chooses to press charges, you will be facing multiple felony counts, and I guarantee you will see the inside of a courtroom." The threat hung in the room, heavy and absolute, Melissa shrank back into her leather chair, her shoulders curling inward. The commanding, arrogant woman who had walked into this office 30 minutes ago was completely gone, replaced by a terrified, cornered thief who finally understood the stakes of the game she had played. "What do you want?" she whispered, her voice cracking under the crushing weight of her defeat. I finally spoke, keeping my voice calm and incredibly steady. "I want you out of my house by sundown," I told her, meeting her tear-filled eyes without a single ounce of pity. "You will pack your clothes, you will leave your house keys on the kitchen counter, and you will never attempt to contact my doctors or touch my paperwork ever again. If you argue, or if you try to take anything that does not belong to you, Arthur will send everything on this desk directly to the police." She did not argue. The broken woman simply nodded, staring blankly at the polished mahogany floorboards. I turned my attention to Daniel. My son looked completely exhausted. His shoulders slumped as he processed the total collapse of his marriage. I did not know how long it would take him to heal, or if our relationship would ever fully recover from the fact that he had signed those medical intake forms. But looking at him right now, I saw a man who had finally woken up from a long, dangerous sleep. "Let's go, Dad," Daniel said quietly, picking up his wool coat from the back of his chair. He did not look at his wife. He did not offer her a ride. He did not offer her a tissue, and he did not say goodbye. My son simply turned his back on her and walked toward the exit. We walked out of the law office together, the heavy wooden door closing behind us with a solid, echoing thud. We left Melissa sitting entirely alone in that silent room, surrounded by the undeniable evidence of her own cruelty, facing the crushing civil and personal consequences of a war she had started and spectacularly lost. Stepping out of the brick building, the cool morning air hit my face, smelling strongly of damp asphalt and impending rain. The tension that had been gripping my chest for weeks finally began to loosen. I pulled my truck keys from my denim pocket, eager to start the engine, because the Oak Valley Veterinary Clinic was only a 10-minute drive down the highway, and it was finally time to bring my dog home. The drive to the veterinary clinic took less than 15 minutes, and the heavy silence inside my truck made it feel like an absolute eternity. Rain finally began to fall from the thick gray clouds, drumming a steady, washing rhythm against the windshield. Daniel sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the blurred suburban streets, his hands resting limply on his knees. We did not speak, because the air between us was already heavy with the wreckage of his marriage, and neither of us wanted to break the fragile peace. When we walked through the glass doors of the Oak Valley Veterinary Clinic, the sharp scent of bleach and medicinal shampoo hit my lungs. Dr. Carter was waiting at the front desk, sorting through a stack of patient files. She did not ask any questions about the legal mediation or why Melissa was absent. The veterinarian simply offered a warm smile, keyed a security code into the heavy wooden door behind her, and walked down the hallway. A moment later, the sharp clicking of claws sounded on the linoleum floor. Roscoe trotted around the corner, letting out a joyful bark, his tail wagging so hard his entire back half shook. I dropped to my knees on the cold tile, burying my face in his thick fur, breathing in the scent of warm dog and safety. He licked my chin, whimpering softly. The cold, suffocating knot that had been sitting in my chest for days finally dissolved completely. Daniel stood a few feet away, watching us with a devastated expression. My son slowly stepped forward, reaching out to rest his hand on Roscoe's head, and the golden retriever leaned into the touch immediately, holding no grudges. "Let's take him home," I said quietly, clipping the red nylon lead to his collar. We pulled into our driveway just as the rain began to taper off into a fine mist. Melissa's pristine white SUV was parked at a sharp, erratic angle near the garage, the rear trunk wide open. Several expensive leather suitcases were already shoved in the back. As we walked up the concrete path, the front door swung open, and my daughter-in-law emerged carrying a heavy cardboard box full of shoes. She stopped dead on the porch, her eyes darting from me, to the dog, and finally to her husband. Her face was pale, stripped of all her usual polished confidence, making her look surprisingly small and fragile. "Dan," she said, her voice shaking as she shifted the heavy box in her arms, "I packed a travel bag for you, too. We can go to a hotel downtown tonight, just to get away from everything, and figure out our next steps together." My son stopped at the bottom of the porch stairs. He looked at the woman who had tried to destroy his father for a payout, and his shoulders finally dropped their tense, defensive posture. "There are no next steps, Melissa," Daniel replied, his voice perfectly steady and completely devoid of the hesitation that had controlled him for years. "You are leaving, and I am staying right here." She stared at him, the cardboard box slipping slightly in her grip as the rain dampened the cardboard. You are choosing him over your own wife? I am choosing the truth, Daniel corrected, stepping aside so she could walk past him down the stairs. Leave your house keys on the kitchen counter. Attorney Bennett will contact you about the civil lawsuit regarding the stolen property, and my lawyer will contact you about the divorce. Melissa did not scream, and she did not try to cry. The absolute finality in his tone left no room for her practiced manipulation. She walked down the stairs in silence, shoved the box into the back of her vehicle, and slammed the trunk shut. We stood on the damp lawn, the wet grass soaking the hems of my jeans, and watched her drive away without a single backward glance. The house felt entirely different when we walked inside. The oppressive, vanilla-scented tension was gone, replaced by the quiet, familiar smell of old wood and damp earth. But there was still a massive pile of legal paperwork waiting to be processed, and a deeply painful conversation we had been avoiding for far too long. Later that afternoon, a courier arrived with a thick manila envelope from Arthur Bennett's office. The lawyer had moved with ruthless, terrifying efficiency. The documents included a formal civil complaint against Melissa for financial exploitation, alongside a revised trust administration file that officially removed her name from every single legal provision. I sat at the mahogany dining table, methodically signing my name on the dotted lines, securing the walls around Eleanor's estate once and for all. Daniel brought 2 mugs of black coffee from the kitchen, setting one down near my stack of papers. He sat in the chair across from me, wrapping his hands around the warm ceramic mug, and looked at the signed civil complaint. He took a slow, ragged breath. I am so sorry, Dad, he whispered, staring down at the dark liquid in his cup. I should have asked you about those medical forms. I should have looked at the date, and I should have listened to you when you swore the gate was locked. I was just so tired of fighting with her, so I took the easy way out, and it almost cost you absolutely everything. I set my pen down, pushing the heavy legal documents aside. I looked at my son, seeing the profound, crushing guilt weighing down his shoulders. He had made a terrible mistake, but he had also stood in a law office today and actively chosen to protect me when it mattered most. He had walked away from his marriage the second he saw the undeniable truth. You were manipulated by someone who weaponized your desire for peace, I told him gently, leaning forward across the table to command his attention. You made a mistake, Daniel, but you made it right today. You are a good man. I forgive you, and we are not going to let her shadow live in this house anymore. My son closed his eyes, a single tear escaping and tracking slowly down his cheek. He nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement, and the terrible distance that had grown between us over the last year finally collapsed. By 8 o'clock that evening, the rain had stopped entirely. Daniel was asleep in his old childhood bedroom, completely exhausted by the emotional toll of the day. The house was wonderfully, perfectly quiet. I walked into the study, the heavy wooden floorboards creaking softly beneath my boots, and turned on the small brass desk lamp. Roscoe followed me inside, curling up into a warm, comfortable circle on the woven area rug. I sat down in Eleanor's old chair, opening the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet one last time. I bypassed the blue folder containing the preliminary trust notes, reaching further back into the shadows, and pulled out a sealed ivory envelope. Arthur Bennett had given it to me right before we left his office, explaining that Eleanor had instructed him to hand it over only when the crisis was fully resolved. My wife's elegant handwriting spelled my name across the front. I slid my thumb under the paper flap, feeling a sudden, sharp spike of adrenaline in the quiet room, and pulled out a single sheet of stationery that held the final piece of her brilliant design. I pulled the single sheet of thick, cream-colored paper from the ivory envelope, smoothing it flat against the surface of the mahogany desk. The faint scent of dried lavender drifted up from the folds, instantly transporting me back to the days when Eleanor would sit in this exact chair, paying bills and organizing our quiet lives. The brass desk lamp cast a warm, golden pool of light over her elegant, sloping cursive. I took a slow breath, grounding myself in the familiar ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, and began to read my wife's final words. "My dearest Harold," the letter began, the dark blue ink slightly smudged in one corner. "If Arthur handed you this envelope, the storm has finally passed. You survived the test, and you kept our boy safe." I leaned forward in the leather chair, following her precise handwriting across the page. Eleanor explained that the massive family trust was never meant to be a simple retirement account, waiting to be drained by greedy relatives. During her final months of chemotherapy, the medical bills had piled up alongside the crushing fear of leaving me completely alone. But Roscoe had been our anchor. The golden retriever sat by her bed every single day, rested his heavy head on her lap, and absorbed the terrible grief we could not speak aloud. My wife knew other families faced that same consuming darkness, often forced to surrender their beloved pets because they could not afford boarding or veterinary care while paying for cancer treatments. She refused to let our life savings become a weapon for my daughter-in-law. Instead, Eleanor transformed our money into an endowment. The $700,000 was the seed money for the Eleanor Mercer Pet Assistance Foundation. The Caretaker Clause was never just about protecting one golden retriever. It was an ultimate, uncompromising character assessment. Anyone who viewed Roscoe as a burden, a nuisance, or a pawn to be sold for $100 would immediately disqualify themselves from managing a charity built entirely on compassion. Melissa had wanted to hoard the wealth, and her own profound selfishness had locked her out of the vault forever. By fighting for the dog, simply because I loved him, I had earned the right to run the foundation. A heavy, cleansing exhale left my lungs, rattling the edge of the stationery. My wife had engineered an absolute masterpiece from her sickbed. She had protected me from a predator, saved our dog, and laid the foundation for a legacy that would echo far beyond the wooden walls of this house. I looked down at Roscoe, who was snoring softly on the woven rug, his paws twitching in some pleasant dream. We had a tremendous amount of work to do, but for the first time in a year, I actually looked forward to the morning. Turning that handwritten promise into a functioning reality took time, but I did not have to carry the burden alone. 6 weeks passed since Melissa packed her leather suitcases and drove out of the neighborhood. The formal divorce proceedings had officially begun, moving at a sluggish pace through the county court system, but the atmosphere inside my home remained remarkably peaceful. Daniel had moved his clothes into his old childhood bedroom, stripping away the last suffocating remnants of his past life. He did not talk about his estranged wife, nor did he offer any more hollow excuses for her behavior. Instead, my son threw himself entirely into the mountain of administrative paperwork required to launch a nonprofit organization. It was a crisp Tuesday morning when we walked back into the Oak Valley Veterinary Clinic together. The waiting room smelled sharply of floor wax and peanut butter dog treats. Dr. Carter met us by the reception desk, wiping her hands on her blue scrubs before offering a wide, genuine smile. Daniel unzipped his leather briefcase, pulling out a thick stack of finalized partnership agreements. We were officially funding a permanent medical boarding program for patients at the local oncology center. My son handed the legal documents to the veterinarian. His hands were perfectly steady, and the exhausting, defensive posture he had carried for years had completely vanished. We were building something meaningful, piece by piece, repairing the fractured floorboards of our family through quiet, consistent effort. Dr. Carter signed the final page with a flourish, officially making her clinic our first active partner. She knelt on the clean tile, scratching Roscoe behind his ears, and fastened a new blue nylon harness around his chest. The side panels bore the freshly embroidered logo of the foundation. He was no longer just a retired carpenter's companion, but rather the founding ambassador of a program that would keep dozens of families whole during their darkest hours. We returned home just as the sun began to dip below the tree line, casting long, golden shadows across the front yard. The autumn air held a sharp chill, promising the arrival of winter, but the front porch felt incredibly warm. I sat down in my old wooden rocking chair, holding a steaming mug of black coffee, and listened to the familiar sounds of the neighborhood. A distant lawnmower hummed down the block, and dry oak leaves rustled softly across the pavement. Daniel stepped out through the front door, carrying a plate of roasted chicken. He sat down on the top concrete step, tossing a small piece of meat down to the grass. Roscoe caught it effortlessly, wagging his tail so hard his entire body shook, before walking up the stairs to rest his heavy chin directly on my boots. There were no secret cameras hiding under the wooden eaves anymore. The heavy metal lock on the side gate remained firmly secured, not out of fear, but out of simple, peaceful routine. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the dark, bitter heat ground me completely in the present moment. We had weathered a terrible storm, fought a silent war in the shadow of my own home, and emerged absolutely intact. The house was finally ours again, and the beautiful legacy Eleanor left behind was just beginning to bloom. When you listen to Harold's story, it is incredibly easy to focus entirely on the shock of the betrayal. You might feel a familiar, painful ache in your chest watching a daughter-in-law mask her boundless greed with a sweet smile, using the trusted language of caregiving to systematically strip a grieving man of his hard-earned independence. It is a terrifying reality that plays out in living rooms across the country every single day. But the true power of this story does not lie in the cruelty of the deception. It lies in the quiet, absolute brilliance of the preparation that ultimately defeated it. There is a profound, non-negotiable lesson here about the realities of aging and the absolute necessity of protecting your own vulnerability. Love and family ties are beautiful things, but they are never a reliable substitute for an ironclad legal document. You cannot simply hope that the people you graciously invite into your home will honor your legacy or respect your boundaries when temptation presents itself. Hope is not a valid strategy when your physical home, your life savings, and your personal dignity are on the line. You have to secure your assets with the exact same fierce, uncompromising protectiveness that Eleanor used when she secretly drafted that caretaker clause from her sickbed. You must pay close attention to the small, subtle things that feel wrong in your own quiet house. When an item mysteriously goes missing from your nightstand, or a financial document is moved, or a conversation is conveniently forgotten by the person standing right in front of you, you cannot brush it off as a harmless symptom of your own aging mind. Thievery and manipulation thrive in the dark shadows of your own self-doubt. You have to trust your own memory above all else. You have to lock your filing cabinets, secure your digital footprints, and never be afraid to verify a legal signature. Setting firm, documented boundaries does not mean you lack love for your adult children. It means you respect yourself enough to ensure your final chapters are written exactly the way you choose, rather than being dictated by the impatience of someone waiting for you to decline. Eleanor fundamentally understood that the true measure of a person's character is always revealed in how they treat the most vulnerable creatures among us. She used a simple, elderly golden retriever as the ultimate, undeniable test of basic human decency. A person who will casually discard a faithful animal for a quick $100 payout will never hesitate to discard an elderly parent the moment they become inconvenient. You have to watch carefully how the people in your life handle the things you cherish, because their daily actions will always tell you exactly what they secretly plan to do to you. This journey leaves us with a quiet, lingering thought about the sacred spaces we build and the people we allow to step inside them. Have you ever experienced a heartbreaking moment where someone you deeply trusted tried to rewrite your own reality? Or have you ever had to take quiet, decisive action to protect your peace and your property from a family member who completely crossed the line? Take a moment to share your own survival experiences in the comments below, because your unique story might be exactly the validation someone else desperately needs to hear today to finally stand up for themselves. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel so we can continue exploring these powerful journeys together, and always remember to fiercely protect the beautiful life you have spent decades building.